A year and a half ago, I made this tweet, November 1st, 2023. And I said, okay, so look, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it looks like COVID may have actually been made in the same military lab where the Pentagon created Lyme disease. And when I made this tweet, it was because I am persuaded by the central thesis put forward in Chris Newby's book, Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons. And the star of that book is a Pentagon military bioresearch lab in Montana called Rocky Mountain Laboratories. And then I saw this from the day before I made that tweet, Halloween 2023. The Daily Mail headline is revealed. Anthony Fauci-run lab in Montana experimented with coronavirus strain shipped in from Wuhan in 2018, a year before the COVID pandemic began. 2018, this is exactly when DARPA did the SARS-CoV-2 fern cleavage site coronavirus work at the Rocky Mountain Lab. And you'll see right here, this image here. This is the Rocky Mountain Lab that shipped in coronavirus samples from the Rocky Mountain, from the Wuhan Institute for Virology, and basically combined DARPA gain-of-function research, work with the same lab that would later, our intelligence services now believe, release COVID-19. COVID-19, which has the unique SARS-CoV-2 fern cleavage sites devised by DARPA. What is DARPA? It's the Pentagon's brain. Who funds the Rocky Mountain Lab? The Pentagon. Now, if you read Bitten by Chris Newby, it's all about the Rocky Mountain Lab and the development of tick-borne diseases to drop them against Cuba. And how in the Rocky Mountain Lab, they were going around the Rocky Mountains of Montana and collecting ticks and fleas and small insects, and then superjuicing them with bacteria to be able to drop them on foreign countries and destabilize those countries by putting all their agricultural crop workers out of work. So imagine my shock when the JFK Files turn up this little beauty. Now we're going to get to that in a second. Here's another screenshot that I attached in that tweet. The star of Chris Newby's book is Willy Bergdorfer, who was like the best scientist in the world on tick-borne bacteria. Bergdorfer grew up in Basel, Switzerland, became fascinated with ticks while a PhD student at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. At the end of his training in 1951, he took up a position at the U.S. government's Rocky Mountain Laboratories in Montana. It held the most extensive collection of ticks in the country. At first, it appeared that the job involved figuring out how to protect people from animals and tick-borne viruses. Like the purpose of superjuicing bat-borne coronaviruses and jumping them from animals to human is to create a vaccine to defend people against such a supervirus. But actually, you're just creating the supervirus. However, Bergdorfer was apparently soon disabused of that notion. During the Cold War era, the U.S. government was heavily involved in bioweapons research. Scientists sought ways to turn infectious microbes, such as anthrax, the plague, brucella, and tularemia, into potent military tools that could disable a huge population. Enter the JFK Files. The group then turned to a discussion of, and you'll see this was bracketed out in the previous release, agricultural sabotage, the very thing that Chris Newby's book describes, that the military was dropping or planning to drop ticks infected with things like Lyme disease onto the agricultural workers of Cuba to destabilize their economy. Now understand, the purpose of agricultural sabotage is the same in Cuba as it is in Syria. Let me show you what I mean by that. Syria, strafing wheat fields, U.S. military. Wheat shortages threaten Syria as U.S. Army loots natural resources. Russia and China sharply rebuked the bandit behavior of the U.S., this is in 2022, whose troops have stolen hundreds of trucks filled with Syrian oil and wheat over the past year alone. We're taking the wheat. Not only that, during the Trump administration, term 1, according to Al Jazeera, the U.S. military was burning wheat fields. What is the military rationale for doing this? Here's Biden appointee Michael Singa's Syria Study Group co-chair, Dana Stroul, describing the U.S. military as the owner of 1/3 of Syria and calling on it to use its control over vast wheat fields as leverage against Damascus. Let's play this.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the
Syrian Democratic Forces. Since she mentions the partner was the Syrian Democratic Forces, I have to play this video. Here you go. Did the whitewashing of a terrorist group into a beloved media darling is literally as easy as a U.S. military liaison walking next door and telling the terrorist group to, quote, change your brand and come up with a new name to call yourself. This is a direct quote from this military general. We literally played back to them that you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourselves besides the YPG? With about a day's notice, they declared they were the Syrian Democratic Forces. Our partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere. Let's listen to this.
As you know, sometimes it's of necessity, who's available. The one that I think is most discussed and most misunderstood is the evolution with our counterpart in Syria, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, interestingly, they came about that name because at one point in time, and I dealt with them directly, I was in on the formative stage of the relationship with these guys. They formally called themselves the YPG, who the Turks would say equated to the PKK. You're dealing with a terrorist enemy of mine. How can you do that, ally? So we literally played back to them, hey, you got to change your brand. What do you want to call yourself besides the YPG? And with about a day's notice, they declared that they were the Syrian Democratic Forces. I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere.
Our partner. So let's get back to this.
Still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate.
The oil. We just happened to have militarily occupied the place which is the economic lifeblood of it.
Here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argue
as well as the agricultural powerhouse. Now, mind you, she's talking about ways to get leverage. And what do we see here? Agricultural, she said agricultural powerhouse. We're trying to do agricultural sabotage of Cuba's agricultural powerhouse.
that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were three others.
It wasn't just about stopping ISIS. It wasn't about stopping ISIS at all. We literally supported ISIS. As I've showed you guys many times on this, and I'll pull this up for folks who may have missed it, the new leader of Syria that we just installed in a military coup, here's his resume. You see this flag? This is the ISIS flag. He was ISIS from 2006 to 2012. He was Al-Qaeda from 2004 to 2006. Al-Qaeda from 2003 to 2016. Now he's the president of the Syrian Transitional Government. From ISIS to Al-Qaeda to the president of the newly democratic Syria. But as she says, no, it wasn't really about stopping ISIS. It was about manipulating the course of political events within Syria. Well, let's go back down to this. Wheat is a weapon of great power in this next phase of the Syrian conflict. This is in August 2020, Max Blumenthal writing, so Michelle Flournoy was part of the West Exec Biden Foreign Policy Incubator, co-founded the Center for New American Security, on the short list to be Secretary of Defense, an arms industry-funded think tank that called for using famine to force regime change in Syria. Okay? Wheat is a weapon. And I'm teeing this up so you understand why it was that the Pentagon created Lyme disease, effectively, is what I'm trying to convey to you here. Okay? Why as we are going to see, why did the Pentagon, General Carter, talk about the need to produce crop failures? Again, all this was redacted until just last week. Produce crop failures by the introduction of biological agents which would appear to be of natural origin. Well, you have to understand, when we're trying to topple a government, as we were trying to topple the government in Cuba in the 1960s, as we're trying to topple the government of Syria for the past decade, through the CIA's Operation Timber Sycamore, and this new push that just worked 3 months ago. The wheat weapon can be used to apply pressure on the Assad regime. Washington can pressure its Kurdish allies to restrict the country's food supply to apply pressure to the Assad regime and force concessions. Okay, they're trying to kill the food supply. This think tank's top donors include Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and BAE Systems. Michael Chertoff was the chair of BAE Systems. Okay, Raytheon, BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman all donate to this group, calling to use wheat as a weapon to induce hunger, to induce regime change. It's also funded by NATO and the Open Society Foundation of George Soros, as well as giants from the oil industry. Until February 2020, this think tank plotting to use wheat as a weapon to starve the people of Syria to force Assad out of office was directed by Victoria Nuland. So before the Biden administration made her head of political affairs at the State Department, and then she became a board director on the National Endowment for Democracy, and a teacher at Columbia University alongside Hillary Clinton and Mike Pompeo. Victoria Nuland ran this. Harnessing the wheat weapon. Wheat can be used to apply pressure on the Assad regime. In Syria's breadbasket, the battle for wheat The article notes Syria is a country where millions depend on bread as a staple of food to survive. Millions of Syrians are food insecure, and crippling sanctions by the U.S. and Europe have exacerbated the humanitarian situation. So we need to exacerbate it even further. Assad needs access to cereal crops in northeast Syria to prevent a bread crisis in the areas of western Syria that he controls. This is what we're trying to do to Cuba. Let's get back to this. The group then turned to a discussion of agricultural sabotage. General Carter emphasized the extreme sensitivity of any such operation and the disastrous results that would flow from something going wrong, particularly if there were obvious attribution to the U.S. He wanted to say, however, it would be possible to accomplish this purpose by methods more subtle than those indicated in the paper. He mentioned specifically the possibility of producing crop failures by the introduction of biological agents, which would appear to be of natural origin. Mr. Bundy said that he had no worries about any such sabotage which could clearly be made to appear as the result of local Cuban disaffection or of natural disaster, but that we must avoid external activities such as release of chemicals unless they could be completely covered up. Now you know why there are so many Pentagon and CIA entities involved in the cover-up of the unnatural origin of COVID-19. Entities like Graphica from the Pentagon's Minerva Initiative Psychological Operation Research Center. Entities like the Atlanta Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, which gets millions of dollars from the Pentagon, CIA pass-throughs like the National Endowment for Democracy, and tens of millions of dollars from USAID. This military intelligence cover-up. Now, I want to get to the sections from Chris Newby's book going over this exact thing. Bad day at the office. Lyme disease discoverer Willy Bergdorfer developing ways to mass produce and infect fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes with pathogens so they can be dropped on U.S. enemies. Here's what she's had to say. The new batch of JFK Files include references to the CIA poisoning sugar shipments, in addition to dropping infected ticks on sugarcane workers, as detailed in my book, Bitten. Cuba Project, Secret Memorandum, Brigadier General Lansdale, 1962. On a most discreet, strictly need-to-know basis, submit a plan on what it can do, and this was all redacted until last week, to put a majority of workers out of action, unable to work in the cane fields and sugar mills for a significant period of time during the remainder of this harvest. It is suggested that such planning consider non-lethal, insect-borne, introduced secretly to the target areas by the Navy. Information for this planning can be obtained by Mr. Robert Edwards at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and Mr. Cornelius Roosevelt at CIA. The plan will require policy approval before implementation. So there it is. The military and the CIA dropping sublethal insect-borne diseases into the workers of the cane fields and sugar mills in Cuba in order to starve the population. Now, of course, Fort Detrick, Maryland, is exactly where the 2001 anthrax attacks. It was discovered that the strain of anthrax that was being shipped to members of Congress who were hesitant about authorizing a war in Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, it turned out it came from the U.S. Army's Fort Detrick Biomedical Research Lab. This was the Bruce Ivins setup. Bruce Ivins was a biodefense researcher at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and the person identified by the FBI in the 2001 anthrax attacks. Before he died of suicide, after learning the FBI was going to be bringing criminal charges against him, the Justice Department, turned out that the anthrax that took us to war after 9/11 actually came from the Fort Detrick lab, the same Fort Detrick lab, just like the Rocky Mountain lab was used both for Lyme disease and for COVID. The Fort Detrick lab was used both for the 2001 anthrax and for the tick-borne diseases to be dropped on Cuba. And note again the involvement of the CIA, just like Avril Haines, deputy CIA director, was involved in Event 201, the live simulation of COVID 1 month before COVID popped off. The CIA pre-planning COVID, as well as the Pentagon's PR firm, Edelman. Funny that. Now, more from her book here. I mean, that is just insane. I mean, they literally, a military CIA plot to use tick-borne diseases, drop them on agricultural workers for the same reason that we burned and stole the wheat from Syria. And not only were they planning to do it, but they were planning in advance to lie about it so that it would look like it was of natural origin. Introduce the biological agents which appear to be of natural origin. Avoid the release of chemicals unless they could be completely covered up. Non-lethal, sublethal. This is like COVID. COVID had the same fatality rate as the flu. It was just the flu in the end. The deaths came from remdesivir and from the putting people on the tubes, the intubators. That's why the U.S. had the highest fatality rate. Run, death is near. Tony Fauci's monstrosity. Same thing with AIDS. To be introduced secretly to the target area by the Navy, because they had a naval blockade. They had control by sea. They were just going to drop the ticks in. More from Chris Newby here. Operation Mongoose, when the CIA airdropped infected ticks on Cuban sugarcane workers. Can you guys see this? A Fairchild C-123, two-engine propeller-driven transport aircraft. The ragtag crew was flying at night, almost skimming the surface of the Caribbean to avoid Cuban radar. The CIA military project was headed up by Brigadier General Lansdale, and the crew was sheep-dipped, given false identities that couldn't be tracked back to the U.S. government. The Texan was the new guy recruited by the CIA right out of college because of his aptitude in learning new languages, his promised adventure. Both pilots were dressed in uniforms adorned with the winged red, white, and blue Air America shield, the emblem of the sham airline run by the CIA for covert operations. Air America is a CIA proprietary. Okay? Even Wikipedia concedes it was an American passenger and cargo airline covertly owned and operated by the CIA. That's what they were flying. The door opened with a blast of air and he saw lush vegetation below. He ripped open the first box and yelled, "What the fuck?" It was crawling with thousands of ticks. In haste, he dumped out the contents of both, threw out the boxes, and slammed the door. The motto of Air America, secretly owned by the CIA, was anything, anywhere, anytime, including ticks. The Texan returned home to his wife and firstborn shortly after the tick drop. A few days later, his son came down with a mild fever. They told him it was probably the flu. It was probably another one of our CIA-born, Pentagon-funded diseases we created. COVID. It was just the flu. But the son's fever kept rising. At 1:05, they rushed him to the hospital with a triage nurse. We don't know what it is. We don't know what caused it, but it'll most likely have permanent brain damage. Now, the only thing the Texan and his wife could do was wait. They began mentally preparing for the worst when a young resident with a Spanish surname approached him and said, "I used to work in a tropical medicine clinic in Cuba, and I've seen this disease before." Later, the Texan asked his CIA operations commander if the illness could be related to his Cuban mission, Operation Mongoose. The commander replied, "I can't give you any details, but you really need to burn all the clothes you took to Cuba. Burn everything." Later, he was told future drops were canceled because of Cuba's shifting winds, which could make an accurate payload delivery difficult. In March 1962, the Defense Department provided a status report to the Special Group Augmented. It contained the following statement: Plan for incapacitation of sugar workers. Tasks as assigned was to develop a plan for incapacitating large sections of the sugar workers by the covert use of biological warfare or chemical warfare agents. Cuba's sugar harvest is expected to run from January 15th to April 15th. Since Cuba is still on a one-crop sugar economy, and since the national economy is a vital underpinning of Cuba's political base, it is a priority concern to disrupt this harvest significantly. So there it is. All right, we're coming up on 4 hours. We got to end with something Cuba-ish. Again, just like COVID, it was sublethal, designed to incapacitate. All right. Thank you all. Good night. Godspeed. I will see you on the internet.